In the dirt yard behind the barracks, the women stood frozen, their arms locked in place by instinct rather than orders. The Americans had gathered along the fence, some of them former ranch hands, cowboys by posture, their hats pulled low against the sun. At the center of the yard stood a lean, black-and-tan hound, ribs faint beneath his coat, ears alert, body unnervingly still. A guard pointed to him and said quietly, almost casually, "He's killed before." The words landed heavier than a rifle shot. The women stiffened. They had seen dogs used for intimidation, for punishment, for humiliation. They expected snarling, teeth, blood. Instead, the hound stepped forward slowly, not toward them, but around them. He walked past trembling bodies, sniffed the ground where one woman had collapsed earlier from hunger, then lay down beside her empty spot, silent, watchful, like a guardian no one had asked for. In a world where cruelty had always worn uniforms, no one was prepared for mercy to arrive on four legs. The women did not move at first. Even after the guards dispersed and the clatter of boots faded, their bodies remained locked, breath held in thin, careful pulls. They were already emptied long before this place. Weeks of transport, days fed on almost nothing, nights pressed together on rough boards that smelled of iron and old fear. Now there were fences, barracks, a sky that looked the same as before. Yet everything below it felt tilted, as if the world had slipped and no one had warned them. They had been trained to expect violence, to measure survival in anticipation. But this camp was quiet in a way that unsettled rather than soothed. Orders came without shouting. Food arrived without spectacle. Guards spoke low, their discipline stripped of cruelty. It was a silence that felt unfinished, like a storm that refused to break. The women walked in clusters, their arms folded, their eyes pointed downward, not from obedience, but from long memory. Their bodies still believed sound meant danger. In those clustered steps, in those thin breaths between routines, the rumor began to move. There is a dog, not a pet, not a stray, a camp hound. Black, lean, sharp along the spine, belonging to the Americans, used for patrol, movement, control, a dog trained for war. Then came the sentence, lowered to a whisper as though volume alone might awaken him. "He has killed before." It passed through the barracks like smoke. No one had seen him yet. That only made him larger. He existed first in imagination, built from memories of dogs used in jungles, on islands, along retreat routes. Dogs had never been comfort in their world. They were tools, instruments sharpened by command. Some said he had tracked escapees. Others said he had been used in Europe to corner men in forests. The cowboys, they said, the guards from wide, open land, handled him as if he were no more than another piece of equipment. That detail disturbed them most, the casualness, as if a life patterned by blood could be worn like a saddle without drama. Every whisper reshaped him. Every retelling enlarged him. Women adjusted their paths, avoiding open corners of the yard. Some refused to step outside alone. Even laughter, rare and brittle, collapsed when his name floated near it. One of them, a former nurse, whose hands had once steadied under fire, began watching the fence with silent focus. Violence always left signs. She had learned that. In breathing, in posture, in the small ways bodies prepare for harm. If the dog was what they feared, his presence would betray him. But the camp offered no confirmation. There was no demonstration, no snarling displays, no deliberate intimidation. He was never dragged into view for effect. He existed only as potential, as the possibility of proof. That uncertainty twisted deeper than any certainty could, and life around them continued in its strange, regulated rhythm. Bread, warm and real, appeared each morning, not snatched away, not reduced to myth. Tasks replaced punishment. Sweeping, folding uniforms, tending thin soil that might produce something green. Their hands moved without orders, shouted into them. That freedom within confinement frightened them more than chains. They had been told captivity meant annihilation of self. Instead, there was routine. That contradiction gnawed. And through it all, the sentence repeated itself, quieter now, but heavier. He has killed before. At night, when the lights dimmed and the yard stilled, some women imagined hearing paws in the distance. Others imagined teeth. The nurse imagined something else, silence around a creature trained for noise. Because what unsettled her most was not that the dog had once been used for violence. It was the possibility that he was no longer being used at all. And if something forged for killing could exist without it, then what, she wondered, did that mean for the rest of them? She carried that question with her the next morning as she dragged the wooden bucket across the yard, its metal handle knocking against the rim with each uneven step. The nurse had scrubbed floors in field hospitals, rinsed blood from uniforms, and carried water through forests that smelled of rot and defeat. But this chore felt heavier than all of those. Not because the work itself was difficult, but because each movement drew her farther from the barracks and closer to the open yard where, rumor insisted, the Hound sometimes patrolled. She kept her eyes lowered, but not out of obedience. It was instinct, the old survival reflex that demanded she keep her gaze small and her presence smaller. She knelt to scrub the wooden slats outside the barrack door, dipping the cloth into the bucket, wringing it out until her fingers stung. The world narrowed to the scrape of fabric against wood, the faint scent of soap, the soft hiss of her own breathing. And then she heard it. Not barking, not growling, just a shift in the air, a subtle weight settling into the space behind her. Her fingers froze mid-scrub. She felt, rather than saw, something watching, a shadow edging into her peripheral vision. She forced her lungs to move. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her head. The Hound sat a short distance away. He was larger than she imagined, ribs faint beneath a coat of black and brown, ears pricked forward, tail resting motionless along the dirt. His eyes were dark, unreadable, the eyes of something that had learned too much. She waited for teeth, for tension, for the inevitable snap of violence she had been told lived inside him. But he did nothing. He only breathed. The nurse's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. Her mind rushed through every warning she had heard, the cowboy's quiet certainty, the whispers of him dragging down wounded men in forests, the muttered fear that he had been trained on prisoners long before she arrived. Each piece of hearsay wrapped itself around her like wire. He has killed before. But here he sat, not lunging, not snarling, simply anchoring himself to the earth as if waiting for something she could not name. She slowly lowered her gaze, not out of submission, but to remind herself she was still capable of choosing where she looked. When she dipped the cloth back into the bucket, the Hound did not tense. When she scrubbed the next slat, he blinked, but did not rise. The silence between them thickened until it felt almost physical. This was not what she had been taught to expect. Fear, she realized, had been built from shapes in the dark, from stories carried across cramped train cars, from the memories of dogs used by officers who saw animals as extensions of power. Every frightening detail she knew about this Hound had been constructed from words, not from experience. But lived reality now knelt before her in the dust, staring back with quiet, unknowable patience. The nurse dared a glance at him. The Hound yawned, stretched out his front legs, and without ceremony lowered himself to the dirt, resting his head on his paws. A creature at ease, not a weapon waiting to strike. A strange warmth, thin, fragile, and quickly smothered, moved through her chest. Not trust, not safety, something smaller. The first crack in a wall she had not realized she kept intact. She finished her scrubbing, aware of his presence with every motion, yet no longer frozen by it. When she stood and lifted the bucket, the hound did not move except to follow her with his eyes. She walked back toward the barracks, steps slow, careful. Halfway there, she felt the truth settle into her like dust. No one actually knew what he had done. They only knew what they had been told. And now, after seeing him with her own eyes, she understood the danger of stories spoken in fear. They could shape a monster out of silence. The women knew dogs as instruments, not animals. In the world they had come from, dogs were not pets. They were sharpened tools of the military machine. During training, instructors had paraded German shepherds through rows of women, barking on command, lunging at straw-stuffed dummies dressed like enemy soldiers. The message was clear: obedience, violence, and fear. That was the animals' purpose. At night, they heard them in the distance, muzzled and chained, pacing like shadows behind fences. Dogs guarded depots, dogs chased deserters, dogs punished weakness. The young nurse remembered a girl from her cohort who had flinched during a drill. The dog had lunged, not on her, but near, a warning. The officer had said, "Hesitation feeds the enemy." That moment had carved itself into her memory like a scar. Even now, her shoulders tightened at the sound of a paw against gravel. But here the hound did not follow that logic. He moved without the violence she expected, never lunging, never snarling. And that dissonance unmoored her. She watched him again a few days after their first encounter. He was trailing one of the guards, not pulled by a leash, not dragged into obedience, but walking alongside with a strange casualness. The soldier tossed a piece of bread into the dirt. The hound sniffed it, then looked back up, uninterested. The soldier laughed and scratched behind his ear. She could not process it. In her world, dogs obeyed commands because they feared the consequences. Here, it seemed, they obeyed because they were trusted. She began to observe the Americans, her thoughts knotting in quiet confusion. The guards talked to the dog like they might a colleague. Not just orders, conversation. One addressed him by name. "Come on, Buck." The dog wagged once, then resumed walking, calm as dust. The shift was subtle, but it rewrote something in her understanding. The same animal. Two meanings. In her world, a dog at your side meant enforcement. In theirs, it meant companionship. Even the other women began to notice. The hound's presence, once feared, now provoked curiosity. A few muttered that perhaps he wasn't the killer after all. Others clung to the rumors, unable to let go. "Just wait," one said. "They use kindness as a net." But day after day, no violence came. That absence disturbed them more than aggression might have. A hound trained to hunt, now sleeping in the sun. A creature of discipline allowed to roam. What were they to make of that? The young nurse, who had learned to equate softness with vulnerability, felt herself pulled toward something unfamiliar. The possibility that this dog had once been a weapon, but had been allowed, somehow, to become something else. She considered what it must feel like to be trained for war and then left to walk among the quiet. No battles, no commands, no leash. The thought chilled her. And yet, beneath the unease, a strange admiration stirred. The dog had survived its own transformation. Could she? It was a dangerous thought, to admire anything here, to question the absolutes that had kept her alive. But the hound had cracked something, not with teeth, but by refusing to be what she feared, and it left her with a question more unsettling than any snarl ever could. What happens when even the enemy's dog refuses to play its part? Her name was Keiko, though few in the barracks said it aloud. She was small even by camp standards, with a frame so thin the bones of her wrists showed through her sleeves like twigs under fabric. At first, many mistook her for younger than she was. 17, maybe, but she was 18. Just old enough to have been swept into uniform before the surrender, just young enough that war still looked strange in her eyes, not carved in like it was for the others. She had not fought. She had only served, cleaning tents, running messages, folding the same square of cloth over and over until her fingers bled. She had been captured while delivering tea. The Americans found her shaking behind a supply cart, clutching a tin cup like it could stop bullets. Now, in the camp, she moved like a shadow. She rarely spoke, not out of defiance, but because she seemed to believe silence was safer. She slept curled at the edge of the barracks, knees tucked to her chest. The others watched her, but did not reach out. They had no comfort left to give, and Keiko never asked for it. It was she who began leaving scraps of bread in the yard. At first, it seemed like foolishness. Bread was precious. No one wasted it, but Keiko would take a portion from her meal, just a corner, just enough to notice, and walk it out to the edge of the yard where the Hound sometimes passed. She would place it gently on the dirt, then sit nearby, not close enough to touch, but close enough to be seen. The first time, the other women held their breath. One whispered, "She's calling death to her side." But the Hound did not growl, did not lunge. He approached the offering, sniffed it, and then, astonishingly, lay down beside it. Not beside her, beside the bread. He did not eat. He simply rested there, as if the gesture meant more than the gift itself. Keiko sat with her legs folded beneath her and ate the rest of her portion in silence. He remained, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his breath. Day after day, she repeated the ritual. The same corner of bread, the same quiet sitting. No words, no reaching out, and each time the Hound joined her. The women began watching from the barracks windows. They whispered about what it meant. Some said the dog saw something in her. A brokenness he understood. Others thought she reminded him of someone else, maybe a child he once protected in another war, another place. The truth was, no one knew. But in that small shared moment, a girl barely clinging to herself, and a creature trained for violence refusing to act on it, something ancient stirred. Not friendship, not trust. Something more primal, recognition. Vulnerability, when met with restraint, becomes sacred. Keiko had nothing to offer him except peace, and he, in turn, gave her something no guard, no prisoner, no flag had ever offered, presence without judgment. He became her silent sentry, not every day, not always, but often enough that the routine began to feel like something living. On days when she wept without sound, he would inch a little closer. On nights when the sky cracked with thunder, and she curled into herself beneath the wooden bunks, she'd later find his prints in the mud near the steps. The others began to shift in their thinking. If this dog, who was supposed to be a weapon, could choose stillness, what else could be unlearned? He had no rank, no ideology, no uniform, yet he carried more moral contradiction than any commander they had known. And beside Keiko, the child the war had forgotten, he did what war never had. He stood watch, without reason, without reward, only because she existed. The Hound had a name before the war stripped it from him. Buck, the guards sometimes said, with a kind of half-smile that came more from memory than affection. Most of the women didn't believe it at first. It was too soft a name for something wrapped in so much whispered dread. But then they heard it spoken again, this time by one of the older cowboys, a wiry man with hands that looked like they'd been carved out of rope and dust. "Buck don't bark much," he told a younger guard one afternoon. "Not unless it's already too late." That was when one of the women overheard the rest of the story. She passed it on, word by word, the way a child might pass a secret behind a teacher's back, not for drama, but because truth, once heard, demands to be shared. Buck had been trained for war, not in the metaphorical sense, not for parades or discipline or the barking rituals of a military base. No, he had been part of a border patrol unit, a real one, the kind used when lines in the dirt turned into blood. He was sent to the Pacific first, trained to sniff out movement, detect hidden figures, strike fast and hard when commanded. There was no room for softness in that work. They conditioned him through hunger, through reward, through fear. He learned how to tear through brush, ignore gunfire, and bring down men who wore the wrong uniforms. He had killed. The words were not spoken loudly, but they didn't have to be. One of the guards, a man who had served with the dog, described it plainly. "We lost 2 boys, got separated. Buck found one of the Japs trying to drag a wounded corporal. He didn't wait for an order. He just acted." The man didn't smile when he said it, didn't grimace either. He just looked tired. "That dog saved lives," he added, "but he paid for it." Because Buck didn't return the same. After the unit rotated out, the Army didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a pet. He wasn't just a guard dog. He was a weapon, one with muscle memory soaked in war. They moved him to a stateside camp, hoping he could be useful again. But something had shifted in him. He stopped reacting the way they expected. He no longer chased when told to chase. He ignored strangers unless they showed aggression first. He slept more than he should. He stared too long at nothing in particular. "Seen that look in soldiers," the cowboy had muttered. "Seen it in dogs now, too. They kept him anyway, not because they needed him, but because no one had the heart to put down a veteran, even one with 4 legs. So the warning had been real. "He's killed before," they said. But it wasn't a threat. It was a caution, a statement not of danger, but of history. Buck was not harmless, but he was also no longer what they'd made him. He had been unmade by what he'd done, and what he'd been asked to do. This realization shifted the women's fear. It didn't erase it. Fear is never that. Simple, but it made it softer, rounder, more human. They began to see the tremble in his stillness, the weight in his silence. Not passivity, but memory. Not control, but exhaustion. Violence leaves scars, even on those trained to deliver it, especially on them. And as they watched Buck move through the yard, slower now, more deliberate, they began to understand what the cowboys had really meant. Not be careful because he's dangerous, but be gentle because he remembers. It happened just before sunrise, when the cold still clung to the ground and breath hung like smoke in the air. The women stood in formation, thin coats drawn tight, shoulders stiff with ritual. Roll call was part of the rhythm now. Step out, stand still, count off. No eye contact, no questions, just cold numbers and silence. The woman's name was Tomiko. She was older than most, not by much, but enough that fatigue clung to her joints like frost. In another life, she had taught music. Her voice, once strong enough to lead choirs, was now reduced to a hoarse whisper. No one remembered the last time she finished a meal. That morning, her knees buckled between counts. She didn't cry out. She didn't even try to break her fall. One moment she was standing, The next, she was a heap of wool and bone on the frozen dirt. Gasps rose from the line, but no one moved. Training held them like iron. Movement without permission meant punishment. Even if the rules here had changed, the memories of old ones did not. Fear doesn't disappear just because the war is over. It calcifies, settles into the spine. And so they stood there, unmoving, hearts hammering behind their ribs. But someone moved. Not a guard, not a medic. Buck. He broke from the shadows where he usually sat, legs unfolding with quiet urgency. The guards didn't stop him. Maybe they didn't think they needed to. Maybe they were as frozen as the rest. Buck didn't pause. He reached her body in seconds. There was no barking, no growling, no dramatic announcement of his presence. He circled once, then lay down, not beside her, but against her, pressing the length of his body to her back, curling just enough to shield her from the cold. His head rested near her neck, his breath visible in the early light. He didn't move, didn't shift, just anchored himself there like a second heartbeat. For a long moment, no one moved. The women stood with their breath held and their fingers clenched, watching a scene they had no language for. The air thickened with waiting, not fear, not yet, but something stranger. Awe, maybe. Then one of the guards stepped forward, raising a hand. Another ran to fetch the camp medic. The rest stayed still, eyes fixed, and the Hound remained by her side, unmoving, until the medics arrived. Only then did he rise, slow and deliberate, backing away, as if he knew his task was complete. Tomiko survived, but that morning something else collapsed, not from hunger or exhaustion, but from the sheer weight of unlearning. The women had watched him for weeks with wary silence, fear, and questions. Now they watched with something else behind their gazes: recognition, reverence, a quiet, almost painful understanding. The Hound had not hesitated. He had not needed permission. He had simply seen a body fall and answered with care. There was no logic for it, no military code, no rule book that said a creature trained for violence should choose compassion. And yet here it was, real, undeniable, witnessed by all. They began to see him differently, not as a threat, not as a symbol of the enemy's cruelty, but as something beyond any uniform. He was there in the background of their days, circling the perimeter, settling near the infirmary, resting beneath the wooden stairs where the youngest girls sometimes left a crumb of rice. The story of Buck no longer fit into the shapes fear had carved. He was not just the dog who had killed. He was the one who had knelt beside a broken woman, not to finish her, but to keep her breathing through the cold. And in a place shaped by silence and loss, that quiet act of warmth cracked something open, not just in Tomiko, but in all of them. Something shifted after that morning, though no one could say exactly when or how. There was no announcement, no order posted on a board, no line drawn on the yard's dirt. It happened slowly, like ice loosening its grip on a frozen river. The women still woke before dawn. They still stood at roll call. They still kept their heads lowered and their words carefully measured. But beneath those habits, another battle had begun, a quieter one, a war that did not involve rifles or uniforms, but the collapse of everything they had been told to believe. For years, they had been shaped by one truth. The enemy was cruel. The enemy was barbaric. The enemy would take and take until nothing remained. That belief had not only come from lectures or posters, but from the way the war had chewed through their cities, their families, their own hands. It had been easier to hate an abstraction than to question a system that had devoured them. Now there was Buck, a creature trained for violence who had chosen restraint, A body once commanded to attack now curling around a fallen woman to keep her warm. If even he could defy the role carved for him, then what else in their world had been carved falsely? The question unsettled them more deeply than hunger ever had. Some tried to fight it. They clung tighter to what they had been taught, repeating old phrases like prayers. "He is still American," one whispered, "still their weapon." But the words had lost their edge. They hung in the air, thin and unconvincing, like smoke without fire. Others went quiet, not the frightened quiet of before, but the stillness of minds working through forbidden territory. They watched Buck move across the yard, noting how he slowed near the infirmary, how he never chased the smallest ones when they stumbled too close. Their eyes observed what their loyalties refused to admit. Propaganda had always relied on distance. It survived because the enemy was kept faceless, monstrous, beyond human reach. But now they stood inside the enemy's land, eating their food, hearing their language, feeling their strange, restrained rhythms. And within that landscape moved a hound who belonged to them, yet refused to behave as he should. He blurred the lines they had been taught were solid. The war outside them had ended. The war inside them had just begun. In the evenings, when the lights dimmed and the barracks quieted, the women whispered not about escape or fear, but confusion. These were dangerous thoughts, more dangerous than dogs, more dangerous than guards, because they could not be escaped. The younger ones adapted faster. Their memories of the old world were shorter, less calcified. They dared small kindnesses toward Buck, a bowl of leftover broth placed near his resting place, a hand briefly resting against his fur. Nothing bold, nothing loud, just quiet acknowledgments of a presence no longer feared. The older women struggled more. Their loyalty had been built over decades, reinforced by loss and blood and silence. To question it now felt like a betrayal of everyone they had buried. Yet each time they saw Buck lying near the fence without aggression, each time he walked past their line without so much as a glance of threat, their certainty fractured just a little more. Fear, once their strongest armor, began to weaken. In its place came something more complicated: awareness, not forgiveness, not admiration, just the first flicker of understanding that truth had been filtered before it reached them. And that realization was both liberation and grief. Because if the enemy was not what they had been taught, then what had they abandoned? What had they destroyed? What had they believed in that never truly existed? The presence of a silent dog had pulled a thread, and that thread, once pulled, did not stop unraveling. By day, they still walked in lines. By night, they walked through memories, through questions, through quiet inner corridors that had long been boarded shut by necessity. And Buck, with his scarred body and patient silence, walked alongside them, not as a captor's tool, but as a living contradiction. Not by barking, not by attacking, but simply by existing differently than they had ever been taught was possible. It happened one evening just before dusk, when the sky turned the color of rust and smoke. The women were returning from the mess hall, boots dragging through gravel, breath visible in the autumn air. The gates were never left open. That much had always been true. Guards were meticulous, movements timed, locks clicked with precision. But that evening one of the side gates hung ajar, just slightly, as if left behind by mistake or mercy. Buck noticed first. He stood at the edge of the barracks yard, his body still, nose lifted slightly into the wind. The women followed his gaze. Silence spread. A gate open meant freedom, or at least the illusion of it. Every prisoner noticed, every heart fluttered. But none stepped forward, except Buck. He approached slowly, deliberate but unafraid. The air seemed to hold its breath as he passed the open gate, and then stopped. Just outside the line of rusted fencing he sat, not pacing, not testing the limits of his leash, but resting, steady as if to say, "I could leave, I choose not to." The women watched from behind the wire. What they saw wasn't a dog seizing freedom. It was a creature who understood that freedom wasn't always about escape. It was about belonging. That moment reshaped the air around them. They had always thought of the fence as a line of separation, them versus the guards, the past versus the future, captivity versus freedom. But now they saw it differently, because if Buck, once a weapon, once a wanderer, once wild, could choose to stay, then maybe the fence didn't mean what they thought it did. That night, lying on hard cots beneath drafty roofs, the women didn't speak about rations or rumors. They spoke of what they had seen. Buck, still as stone, outside the gate, the world beyond him stretching quiet and unknowable. One woman said softly, "He didn't run." Another replied, "Maybe he's freer than we are." But even that thought began to change. Freedom, they realized, was no longer just a place, a forest, a border, a distant home. It was something internal, something chosen. For the first time, captivity began to feel less like punishment and more like pause, a space between storms, a strange, unwanted gift. Time to think, time to forget, time to rebuild. Some began to see the camp not just as a cage, but as a cocoon. What they would become afterward, they didn't know. But the woman who had collapsed no longer walked with her eyes to the ground. The young girl who once feared Buck now trailed him at a respectful distance. And the nurse, who once flinched at every sound, found herself listening more closely, not to commands, but to the quiet. They were still prisoners. That hadn't changed, but something inside had begun to rearrange. The enemy was no longer just the people on the other side of the fence. It was the fear that told them they had no choice, no say, no future. And in Buck's choice to sit, when he could have run, they saw a lesson no sermon could teach. Sometimes the hardest freedom is staying. If you're moved by this story so far, like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your voice matters in keeping these human stories alive. The morning Buck disappeared, no one noticed at first. The sky was still gray, the air still damp, and the same old call for roll echoed across the yard. The women lined up like they always did, eyes on the horizon, hands at their sides. Routine was a shield, but something felt off, not in the sounds, not in the motions, but in the silence that followed. A silence without breath, without padding pause in the gravel, without the soft groan of Buck settling near the gate. It was the youngest girl who spoke first. "Where's Buck?" The question moved like smoke. Unacknowledged, then undeniable. Eyes searched the perimeter, the shadows beneath the barracks, the steps near the mess hall where he sometimes waited in the sun. But the dirt where he had once rested was untouched. No paw prints, no fur. Just an absence, shaped like presence. No one said he was taken. No one said he was gone for good. There was no announcement, no guard stepping forward to explain. It was as if he had simply unexisted, vanished in the quiet between one breath and the next. But the women felt it. Not in panic. There was no scream, no chaos, only stillness. And in that stillness came something deeper than fear. Grief. It wasn't just the loss of a dog. It was the absence of something they hadn't known they relied on. His watchful presence had been a strange anchor in a world built on uncertainty. Not a friend, not a protector. Something older, quieter, a sentinel of contradiction. The nurse, who had first feared him the most, sat beside the fence after evening call. She didn't say a word, but her body leaned slightly toward where he used to be. The girl who'd once left crumbs near his paws now held on to a crust of bread all day, unsure whether to throw it or keep it. Without Buck, the camp didn't change physically. Meals were still served, gates still locked. But something in the air had thinned. The silence now echoed differently. His presence had been like breath, unnoticed until missing, and in that absence the women realized what he had given them. Not safety, not clarity, but something rarer, reflection. His quiet, his patience, his refusal to obey the script of monster or machine had offered a mirror, one that showed them not who they were told to be, but who they might become. Now, with that mirror gone, they had to hold the reflection on their own. Some whispered that he had been reassigned, others feared the worst, that some higher-up had decided a war dog had no place among prisoners. But no one really knew, and in that not knowing they carried a new kind of weight. Not all grief is loud. Sometimes it's just the way your eyes linger on an empty patch of dirt, the way your breath catches when you pass the mess hall, the way you hope, foolishly, silently, to hear that soft padding step one more time. And perhaps most of all, it's in how you carry forward, how you remember without memorials, how you build new meaning around a space that once held comfort. They never replaced him. No other dog was brought in. No new companion took his post. In that absence, something was preserved. Because Buck had never belonged to the guards, or the prisoners, or the war. He had belonged to the in-between. And now, even in disappearance, he continued to teach them something none of their captors ever could, that even a silent presence can change the shape of a day. That kindness, however brief, does not vanish. It lingers, and in its absence becomes even more profound. Years passed. The war receded into sepia photographs, monuments, and stiff classroom lectures. Cities rose from their ashes, roads reconnected villages once severed by bombs, and new sounds filled the silence that once belonged to sirens. In this rebuilt world, survivors found ways to carry on. Some by forgetting, others by holding fragments too sharp to release. For Tomiko, the nurse who had once feared the shadow of a barking dog, memory returned not with violence, but with quietness. It came to her unexpectedly, years later, while she walked a narrow street in post-war Nagoya, the basket in her arms heavy with oranges. The street was paved now, lined with trees instead of smoke. Children laughed as they chased a ball past her legs, their shrieks full of life she once thought impossible. Ahead, a small, lean pup emerged from behind a vendor's cart. He didn't bark, just stared, tail tucked, but curious. She stopped, knelt gently, and tore off a small piece of bread from her lunch. The dog didn't take it, but he didn't run either. He simply sat like he was waiting for her to understand something. And she did. She had seen this stillness before. In another time. In another dog, Buck. Not a beast, not a symbol, but something unexplainable that stood between what was expected and what was possible. The memory came not as a rush, but as a slow breath. A hound standing just outside the gate. A silent body pressed against hers when she collapsed. A presence that had no obligation to offer comfort, yet did. In that moment on the Nagoya street, Tomiko realized Buck had not just been a dog in a camp. He had been a question made flesh. He had asked, can something built to harm choose to protect? Can restraint survive war? He had not answered with tricks or affection, only with choice. Over and over he had chosen not to hurt, not to flee. And for a woman once taught that the enemy was incapable of compassion, that truth had broken something inside her, not with violence, but with gentleness. Now, older, walking freely under a sky unbroken by planes, she knew what Buck had given them was not rescue, it was reflection, a mirror that revealed what propaganda had stolen, that those we fear most can be capable of mercy, that we ourselves can still choose who we become, even after the worst. As the stray wandered off into the alley, Tomiko stayed a moment longer, holding her breath, as if she might hear those familiar steps behind her once more. But the street remained still, and that, too, was peace. She often thought of the women in the camp. Some had died, some had disappeared into the quiet routines of post-war life, but all of them, she was certain, carried Buck with them. Not as a legend, but as a turning point, a shift, a moment when they saw that even within barbed wire something human had survived. Because in the end, Buck had never belonged to the war. He had existed despite it. And when he vanished, he left behind something rare, the belief that healing didn't begin with victory or vengeance, but with the refusal to repeat the violence handed down to you. If this story stayed with you, like the video and comment below where you're watching from. History lives through attention, and you're part of that now.